lecturer is also touching the points of design, you know, printmaking and design, the printer. Andrew Stein Raftery, would you please come up? Yeah, we'll give him a big hand. Now, I'd like to ask you, Andrew, what would you like me to say about you as an introduction?
Well, everybody should know that I'm an engraver, and that I'm professor of printmaking at RISD, where I've worked since 1991, Rhode Island School of Design in Providence, Rhode Island. And I'm a national academician. And when I was elected as a worker in the graphic arts. But we got rid of that nomination, unfortunately. And the other thing I'm very happy about is that I am a member of Print Council of America, which is a group of print curators, conservators, and scholars. And I've recently joined the board, and it's an incredible organization. So.
Well, thank you. You did this beautifully, so I just leave you the audience.
Well, I have a question for you, too.
Okay, well,
the other thing I want the audience to know is that I am very committed to the whole idea of objects and you know, experiencing works of art in real life. And I brought something that I was hoping that we could pass around to the audience. It's one of my pieces that I just pulled out of the kiln last week and made it in Providence. So here it is in Oslo, where I'm so happy to be.
Hands-on.
Hands-on,
pass
yes.
it around. Thank you.
It's just this. Hello, everyone. I am so honored to be here, and Jan, thank you so much for having me. So when I tell people that I'm an engraver, they always say to me, well, you must be the only person doing that. And I sort of say, no, I have friends in Germany and Japan, and they're great French engravers, and I teach all my students engraving. But that's not really answering the question, because the question is a little bit different. I mean, I think the real question is, why bother doing this technique that takes so long, that's been obsolete since the middle of the 19th century? You know, why do it? And I think that's a very important question. And not just about engraving, but it's a question that every artist who uses some of the time-honored techniques that have been active since the Renaissance to make work, we have to ask those questions, because otherwise the danger is that we could slip into a kind of preciousness, a kind of sentimental, historical thought. And I think that's why I wanted to talk about engraving today and use my own experience as a kind of case study to answer that question. And in order to answer that question, I have to go back to the very beginning, because any of you who are students know that one of the most important experiences as you're learning is that certain things come across to you and you feel a special affinity for and an inclination for a certain technique. And in 1980, I started at Boston University and found an extremely traditional art school in which in every class there was a naked person in the middle of the room, and there was one way to do it, and that's the way that the teacher told us to do it. But in our third year, we were actually allowed to take an elective in printmaking, and I was so excited, because that was the one classroom where there wasn't a naked person in the middle of the room. We could actually come up with our own ideas, and our professor, Sidney Hurwitz, was really committed to watching us work and thinking of things that might help us and showing us how to do things. And so one day he came into the classroom with this tool and a piece of copper, and this tool is called a burin, and he said, Andrew, I think you might like to learn engraving, because he had watched me organize my lines in etching. And so he showed me how to sharpen the tool. He showed me how to cut the lines in the plate. And as I practiced this, I became very excited because it just seemed so natural to me. It was something that really satisfied my own inner need for this kind of very careful crafting of the object. But it also allowed me, and I'm showing you this very funny print I made in 1984 when I was a senior, it also allowed me to try out some of the things that I was learning in the life class about how to put a picture together and to really indulge in my own very kind of linear sensibility. And so engraving stayed with me throughout those years, but also even when I was a graduate student in Yale. And I also did many other things, but I knew it was there as something that I would eventually turn to. Now, most people don't know that I used to be a painter. And this is a painting from 1996 that's very typical of the work that I was doing at that time. It shows the Clinique counter at a fancy mall. And it shows two moments of time, the same moment of time, but with two different points of view. And we see this provocative glance between these two men. And I was very interested in sort of exploring the way that gay people and straight people interact in public spaces without us even knowing it. When you open up the doors, there's a triptych on the inside, and that interpersonal reaction has gone away, and the whole thing becomes about commerce and the final sale of the makeup and the exchange of the credit card. Now, even as I was working on this painting, I have to say that I was kind of worried, because I felt the drive in this work was towards ever greater verisimilitude, ever greater realism, and that kind of smoothing out. And that didn't really interest me, and it really seemed like a kind of conservative impulse that would lead nowhere. And I knew I had to figure out how to make it clear that my images were actually constructed fictions. And I think that going more towards realism wasn't going to do that. My contemporaries, such as Lisa Yuskavage or John Curran, who were at Yale right before me, or the Leipzig painters, I think they accomplished that, making that constructed fiction evident through distortion and the grotesque. But I'm very committed to this kind of surface of plausibility, this kind of reality that we recognize. I don't want to go to surrealism, and I resisted breaking that layer of plausibility. And I have a quote from Gertrude Stein that actually describes what I'm thinking of. It's from the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. So Gertrude Stein writes in Alice B. Toklas's voice, and here's Miss Toklas describing Miss Stein. She always says she dislikes the abnormal. It is so obvious. She says the normal is so much more simply complicated and interesting. So the solution came to me in 1998 with a print that I've been looking at since 1992, and it's the first old master print that I collected. It's by Claude Milon. He's a French engraver working at Rome in this time. It's from 1630, and it had been hanging in my bedroom all that time. And when I think about works of art and close looking and living with works of art and having the chance to experience a work of art over and over again, I really feel that looking at this print helped me to get to the next place. Because as I was falling asleep or waking up, the image was always so clear. And it wasn't just the image that was clear, it was the marks that made up the image. And it's an engraving, and I said, I can do that. So I had a set of drawings for another shopping narrative sitting around, and I reworked them to make them closer to the Claude Milon composition, so that there would be the kind of size as in the Claude Milon composition. And I just started, transferred them to the plates and started these plates. And the subject of this narrative is a man shopping for a suit. And so you can see one space with two different moments of time. And you can see that I appear in the background with my partner, Ned. And it's very important that I'm there because I'm a witness to this scene, but also like a narrator in a Jane Austen novel or Henry James, I'm an insider, and even though this is a satirical work, I'm also subject to the satire that's contained in this work. The triptych opens up, and we see the man being fitted for the suit. We see the girlfriend buying the tie. And then in the final scene, we see the man checking himself out in the dressing room. So the narrative is really all about looking at male bodies, touching them, evaluating them, but in the end, it's all about his vanity. And if you look at the shadow behind the man, you can see that it has a certain kind of cross-hatching in it. And the Claude Milon that hangs in my bedroom has cross-hatching. But as I began to research Claude Milon's work more, I learned that he had perfected a style of engraving that worked without outlines, without cross-hatching, and even without dots to describe forms. So he really took away all these elements to create this incredibly simplified and beautiful language of form. And when we look into the details, it's almost hard to understand why we know that these are three men mounted on horses running in the smoke of battle. But it's there, we understand it, and that's what's the wonderful thing about this linear system. It's so simple, but it's also so abstract. And for me as an engraver, the other thing that's so exciting, and this is another reason of why engraving, is I can look at this detail and see where the tool entered the copper and exited the copper. I can see where he went in, and I can see, again, all those things. And I think the fact that the engraving has this kind of self-evident quality of its making gives a link to the past that I find very exciting. So after about 3 years, I finished the plates for Suit Shopping, and I published it in 2002. And I was in an entirely different world than I had been when I did that, those paintings. And I had to sort of step back and think about what I had learned from that work. So I started another project. And I think my goals with this project, which is called Open House 5 Engraved Scenes, was to see how far I could push those lines, how big they could be, how far apart they could be, because these are much larger prints. And also to see that if I could make a work that was entirely responsible to itself as a graphic work. Suit Shopping had really originated as an idea for a painting, what it would be like to plan something entirely as a print. So I don't know how they do it here, but in the US, when you want to sell your house, you call up a real estate agent. He or she tells you to fix things up a little bit. Then one Sunday afternoon, you leave the house. The real estate agent puts up a little sign outside the door on the lawn. You see that out front. And then people come and look at the house. And it's fascinating to do that, because you go and look at the house, and you try to figure out who lives here. They're not there, but their stuff is there. And so that's really largely what this narrative is about. It's about figuring out the absent owners, and then looking at the interactions between the characters who are coming in that are more incidental. And I think Margaret will laugh that the people who own this house actually have a Mapplethorpe photogravure, and, but it's been rendered in engraving. So I think I did the first reproductive engraving of Mapplethorpe. You move from the living room into the dining room, where you see their marvelous 80s decorative arts, and that tells you a little bit something about who they are. And if you look out the window at the right, you'll see the man with his hand on his hip talking to the man with the baby Bjorn. And in the next scene, we see those characters again. And what that is the clue to this, the time frame in this narrative is simultaneous. So that looking down the hall, we see that woman who was coming in at first. We go to the upstairs hallway, where the main realtor is the woman standing at the top of the stairs with the clipboard. This was before the real estate crisis, so maybe 2006 is when it hit us in Rhode Island, and so she's hoping for a bidding war. By the way, I finished this in October 2008, so it was just perfect. And the final scene takes you to the master bedroom, so we've penetrated to the most intimate space. And there are many details along the way, but here we see the 2 pairs of men's shoes under the bench in front of the bed, and we realize that this is a household of a gay couple. But we also see that the man looking at the print over the bed is looking at the triptych from Suit Shopping. So once again, it's a narrative where I'm the narrator, but I'm also within this world. My process for developing this work involved building a scale model of the house. And that allowed me to actually see all the scenes in a simultaneous way. I was able to light the sculptures, draw them in wash nude. And this is a time-honored technique from Poussin and Géricault doing the Raft of the Medusa. Then work up the clothing. And I actually bought almost all the clothing and all the shoes that the people are wearing. I'm very much into that kind of research. And then finally working on the engraving, and I work through the layers of space. So I do the figures first, the foreground, the middle distance, and the background. And I worked on it for 5 or 6 years, and people always ask me if I get bored. But it's when I get to inventing these lines that all that preparatory work really gets to be worthwhile. And I start to really be very invested in that abstraction. So I'd like to show you my work in progress. So if you visited my studio in Providence, this is what you'd see. I have some studies. I have these plates that I've been working on. I have some things from my own collection of historical plates by Claire Layton. But my project is actually bringing two very important parts of my life together. And one of them is an ornamental flower garden I work on at my mother's house. And so there's the front yard, but we see it from above here. And it's a very kind of Victorian garden. And there's a lot of annual plants that I grow from seeds, and everything's quite lined up. And I think it's also kind of an engraver's garden because of that kind of organization. But for me, it's also a great spiritual exercise, because I like everything to be very organized, and then things go a little bit crazy. But my lettuce stays very organized. The other thing that I'm drawing on is a collection that Ned and I have been working on for about 25 years. And it's of British transfer printed earthenware. Our period is from between 1810 to 1850. And we have about 1,500 pieces. So I think we might officially be under that category of hoarders. And we live with it. We eat off of it. We touch it all the time. I look at it all the time. I've never gotten tired of it. And I love it because it's a print collection to me. The images on these plates were made from engraving. And I've always wanted to do a project that involved bringing my engraving to the pottery. So I've devised a project. The subject is me working on my mother's garden in Providence over the 12 months of the year. There are 12 different plate shapes that I've designed, and I'm producing it in an edition of 100. And I've been working on that since about 2009, and I anticipate finishing it and having an exhibition next fall. And I have no design background at all, but I work at a great design school, and I think I've learned from the ethos of the designers there that you just have to go for it and really kind of enjoy it. And so I designed the plate shapes first with folded paper, many of them referring to the historical plate shapes, but some of them just referring to the divisions of the things. And I'm not going to go into the technical part because that would take an hour, but it's been incredibly exciting, but I'd like to acknowledge my incredible collaborators. So these three assistants, one of them a student at Wesleyan, the other two are at RISD, Nita Mukan, Sarah Wang, and Elisa Palau, helped me to make the models out of Sintra. This is my ceramics guru. He's a professor, Larry Bush, at RISD, and he devised the clay and did the entire ceramics support. And you see Larry in his favorite place in the world, but I wish you could see the kilns here. I've been emailing him about them. Here's his recipe, and he made the recipe for the clay with 180 clay tests, and he wanted to make a clay entirely out of American materials, but he also devised the production method, which uses these two-part dies that are where the plaster is cured with air, and the plates are produced by an old-fashioned style of 3D printing on this hydraulic press called the ram press. And I loved doing this because it was just like printing. And we made 1,800 pieces. And I have to say, I probably pressed 1,500 of them. This is our genius from Shanghai, Jack Yu, who was a grad student at RISD. And he's still helping me, but everybody's always trying to hire him away. And he perfected the glazing. He really perfected the absolute temperature for firing the glazing. And I also have to mention your faculty member here, Paul Scott, who's really helped me to figure out how to get an engraving to stay on a piece of pottery. And we've had sort of this long-term conversation, exchanging details, and we had this exhibition in Providence this spring, but I think it's only the beginning of some great collaborations with Paul. And in the exhibition, I displayed the 12 plates on a wallpaper that I designed and printed in letterpress. And one of the plates is finished in this case, but this shows the 12 shapes. And as we worked on them, all of the shapes got names. And eventually, even though they're abstract, they had their associations in these profiles, and they became identified with a certain month. So that happened in the process, and that part was indeed collaborative. Of course, the most important part is designing the images, and that involved many studies from the garden, sitting outside, just getting a feeling for the atmosphere and the kind of places, and then devising the 12 scenes. So in January, I'm looking at seed catalogs in bed with old master engravings over the bed. In February, I'm planting seeds in my kitchen. In March, I'm watering up my cold frame. In April, I'm digging out my beds. In May, I'm cultivating lettuce. In June, I'm training a passion vine. In July, I'm fertilizing. In August, I'm tying up a castor bean. In September, I'm mowing. In October, I'm bringing in chrysanthemums. In November, I'm digging dahlia tubers. And in December, I'm contemplating the garden in the snow. I made wax figures to study the various figures, and that really helps me to understand the body and then also to deal with the drapery so that it doesn't, the folds don't distract from the form underneath. And my final model for the print is this painted study. I painted it in Flash, and it has everything I need to know. I trace the study, shrink it down, transfer it for the plate, and make the engraving. And this is the first engraving I did. And I thought it looked pretty good on a piece of paper. But when I printed it onto the plate, it really felt too dense, a little bit constrained. And I knew that I had to rethink my process. So I went to my next painting, which is of me cultivating the lettuce. And here you can see my work area, where I have the painting, I have some sources for the lettuce, but I always work or try to work in the presence of works of art. And I have these two works of art on my table. One is an engraving from 1932 by a brilliant French Art Deco engraver named Jean-Émile Laboureur. And this detail of the oak leaves in his engraving Entomologist, it's called, is kind of my talisman, because he really describes the fullness of the tree without bothering to shade every leaf. I look at this print with my magnifiers all the time. And next to it is a print from 1573 by Cornelis Cort. And I think the way that Cort relates the outline and the shading is very powerful, and it was very, very helpful to me. So here in the detail, the mustard greens, you can see how I've incorporated Laboreur's technique, and in the figure, how I've incorporated some ideas from Cornelis Cort. And when this print was printed onto the pottery, it had a kind of glow and openness, and there was a relationship between the image and the edge, which I think is something I really learned from. But then I also realized that the glaze, those lines in glaze that are fired on the pottery, have a very different quality than the ink on the paper. The ground of the pottery is so brilliant and bright and really creates a kind of glow of light. And there's something slightly translucent about the blacks. And I realized that this really required me to adjust my engraving style. And so here's an example of the plate. And the plates for my older engravings used to look like holograms. But my new plates, I think, have the kind of sparkle of decorative metalwork. And even when I look at the details, and as I'm working on the plates, what I'm thinking of is micro-decoration. I'm thinking that each piece of the cross-hatching and each mark has to be responsible to its ornamental purpose as decoration on this plate. And even in some of the architectural areas, one could see that the moldings could almost be taken off and used as kind of rickrack on sort of decorative types of things. And this is even held true in my back stamps, where I've explored what might be the potential ornaments for the borders if I'd ever want to do that. The interesting thing about these prints is that on paper, they look unfinished. I would never publish a print where the sidewalk didn't fill out the circle somehow, or where that background area to the right isn't shaded. But it needs that openness to really exist on the pottery with the border acting as a frame. Now, I'm going to end with the most incredible experience that I think we very rarely allow ourselves to do, and that is to redo our own work. So here on the left is the print that I thought didn't work out so well, and then I re-engraved that plate in light of what I had learned from this process. And I feel that the re-engraved plate does have more openness, more relationship, and more responsiveness to the decorative qualities of the required by the print. Here it is on paper, and here it is on the final plate. Now, I rewrote my ending a little bit because of things that I feel I've learned over the course of the seminar and in response to certain things. And I'd like to just sort of conclude by saying that, first of all, I do want all of you to know that I realize that this prolonged engagement with engraving has taken me to an extreme place. I know that. And that's both in relation to contemporary culture and contemporary art. So if we're working in the fields, I'm way at the fringes there. But I have to admit, I do not feel embattled in this place. I'm excited about it. I think I'm more of an explorer than a hermit, and that's a good thing. And I'm really eager to go even further. I have more ideas about what to do with this. And I have to say that one of the things that's helped me on this, with this over the past 15 years since I first published Suit Shopping has been the incredible support of the print community. You know, that has all across the board, whether at the print fair, and museum curators, and print council, print dealers, artists, the wonderful students and collectors, the people that I've met here. It's a really special thing, and I don't think every artistic category or discipline has that. And I really do appreciate it and very grateful for it. And I do think it says something for our extended field, or expanded field, that even someone as extreme as me can be part of the whole thing. So I call my new project The Autobiography of a Garden, and that's partly in a tribute to Gertrude Stein, but mostly because you can learn almost everything you need to know about the garden, its inception, growth, climax, decline, and dormancy from looking at the 12 plates. But what about that middle-aged man who goes about making the garden with such determination? This project is satirical, like all my work, so it is okay to laugh at the genteel absurdity of his activities, his outfits that would not be out of place for a gardener in the same plot of land in the 1930s, but maybe not the sandals, and his ornamental flower garden, which certainly would have delighted a visitor from the 1840s. We do not learn very much about him, but he's seriously devoted to labor that makes beauty. To take this satire into critique, perhaps we could say he is an unrepentant aesthete. So what really is at stake with this work? Stepping away from the character and back to myself, I see this work as a rejection of cultural homogenization, consumerism, degradation, and yes, I have to admit it, ugliness and vulgarity. It's an expression of my anger that as a person and a gay man, I live in a world that would reduce me to an object of marketing strategies. It is my utter rejection of the idea that a computer algorithm can know anything about me or my desires. And it shows my belief in the power of art to resist mediocrity and worse. And that is why I do engraving. Thank you.